An action-packed day indeed at the Oval Office yesterday. Now tonight we dissect the legitimacy and substance of South Africa's delegation during the meeting between President Ramaphosa and Donald Trump, which occurred at the Oval Office in Washington, D.C. last night. At the epicenter of what was to be a trade and bilateral discussion was the alleged white Afrikaner genocide in the country. We saw emotions run high, but the question remains, did the delegation's composition and their actions align with the country's interests and priorities? To help us unpack this is Dr. Oscar Van Heerden, Research Associate at the UJ Center for African Diplomacy and Leadership. Good evening to you, Oscar, and thank you for joining us this evening.
Good evening, Becky.
Now let's dive right into it. How do you assess the value and substance of South Africa's delegation to the Trump meeting?
Look, I think that we can all agree that because when you have things in your arsenal, then you take them out. There was this claim, and I think that Ramaphosa and the delegation knew that somehow the white genocide matter is going to come up. So we took 4 white males with us. Firstly, the Minister of Agriculture, because there's a claim of farm killings, a white male, also the leader of the official opposition, and part of Ramaphosa's government. I think that in itself speaks volumes. Then you had 2 very successful sportsmen, golfers, that is saying that they are very comfortable in South Africa, that they live in South Africa, and that they are plowing back in terms of building houses and so forth for their families. And then, of course, you have Johan Rupert, who is the wealthiest South African man, white, very privileged, represents privilege, and again, standing shoulder to shoulder with his black president, Ramaphosa, here in the Oval Office to not only show support, but also to set the record straight in terms of the fact that what we have is not a race problem, but a crime problem. So I think that was the optics. And of course, we had the ministers. I think it's very unfortunate that President Ramaphosa didn't call on them to also say a few words. I'm sure that the Minister of State Security, as well as Lamola, we know how eloquent Minister Parks Tau can be. I think they would have added some flavor to the statistics and so forth. So it's very unfortunate they didn't speak. But I do think any mature journalist that was standing in the room would have been able to pick up those subtleties as to why 4 white males were brought, Afrikaners for that matter, was brought as part of the delegation.
And did the composition and their actions align with the country's interests and their priorities?
Look, I think that I was slightly disappointed with Minister Steenhuisen. I think he knew, and everyone knew, the main reason why he's part of the delegation is when that issue of white genocide comes up, we wanted to hear the words come from his mouth, which he has said before in public. And this was an opportunity in the Oval Office, in front of international media, to say categorically, there is no white genocide. Unfortunately, for some or other reason, he chose not to say those words, but he did clarify the Julius Malema and the Zuma matter, and the fact that the GNU is wanting to keep those kinds of populist leaders out of government. So I think he said some valuable things, of course, but the main messaging, unfortunately, he fell short to actually stipulate that.
Now, what role did politics play in their selection, and was it appropriate, and why was Mcebisi Jonas left out of this delegation?
I'm made to understand that Mcebisi Jonas was stuck in London and for some reason couldn't make the way to Washington, D.C. I think it would have been an important value add, considering that he is our envoy, who is supposed to be smoothing matters over. I think that between Minister Parks Tau, Trade and Industry and Competition, and Minister Steenhuisen, they've informed us with the press conference after the circus of the 40 minutes in the Oval Office, that they've made some strides in terms of agreements. There's been some commitments from both sides. I think now we can safely say that the door is open. It would be very difficult for Trump to shut the door yet again. And so now that it's open, it's the beginning of resetting that relationship.
Now, it is said that certain members of the delegation were included at Trump's request. Is it common practice that a host country dictates the formation of a visiting country's delegation, or is that an overreach?
It is an overreach, but we're dealing with Trump. You know, Becky, we have this. A good friend of mine reminded me of a Turkish proverb that says, when you take a clown into a palace, it doesn't mean the clown becomes the king. What it means is the palace becomes a circus. And that is what we saw last night. Dim the lights, let's see a movie, and let's try and ambush the South African delegation. It completely backfired. Everyone saw it for what it was. I think this is going to be a low point on Trump's legacy amongst many other low points. It just didn't do. It never got its intended outcome. I think that President Ramaphosa addressed the matter with poise, with dignity. He was composed. He kept his composure. He sternly said, no, it's not true. We are a constitutional democracy. Trump even lied, in saying that if anyone in America should say that he wants to kill this one or that one, that person will be arrested immediately. It is simply not true. America is also a constitutional democracy, freedom of speech. There's the Fifth Amendment, there's the First Amendment, and so on. So, I think that what is important here is that Trump wanted to close the chapter that has been choreographed since February, since he took office and signed the executive order, making all kinds of falsehoods and untruths and lies about South Africa. And last night he concluded it. I'm sure he thinks on a high. Unfortunately, the world doesn't.
Now, Dr. Van Heerden, how big a moment in South African history was this event?
It was a very historical moment because since the dawn of democracy in South Africa, all U.S. administrations have always taken South Africa serious. There's a story that says that President Clinton in the early 90s asked the State Department, give me a list of 10 countries which I cannot ignore. And South Africa was on the list. And every subsequent administration in the United States has taken South Africa serious until Donald Trump arrived and wanted to now create a rift, wanted to blacken the name of the moral authority of South Africa by claiming that there's genocide happening in South Africa against white Afrikaners. I think the whole thing was choreographed. We had to get the 49 so-called refugees in America before Trump invited Ramaphosa to come, and then the coup de grace, according to Trump and his ilk, was to say, dim the lights and let's watch a movie. It was pathetic, it's cheap diplomacy, and as I say, everyone saw it for what it was. The operative word in all international media around the world was ambush.
Thank you so much. It seems that's all we have time for on this topic. Thank you for your insightful analysis tonight, Dr. Van Heerden. It was indeed a pleasure chatting to you.
Always a pleasure, Becky.